So what we see is that a non-junction of the lamina will cause a congenital defect, which is called spina bifida, to where the nerve bundles may not excrete out, but bulge out from the spine. Note how there is a spinous process up here, but the spine is incomplete coming around the posterior side, which allows for the meninges, the spinal cord, the fluid, and becomes literally a sac. Spina bifida. Spina bifida, once again, is an incomplete closure of the posterior ring of the vertebral canal. More specifically, the lamina and the spinous process do not fuse together. Kind of hard to tell on this repeatable KEV. Note how they didn't include the pubic bone, but we can see the 12th vertebrae. We see the floating rib coming off. In the center, coming down, is usually a round, oblong density. That would be the spinous process. What we're seeing down here is that there is an incomplete, or we don't tend to see the spinous process, so it's incomplete on that. Kind of hard on that one. I'm sure there's better images. You can actually see where the spinous process is here. Yet look at the shape or the length of that one versus this one. It just is, it's changing shapes as we go inferiorly. Okay, so 4 articular processes arise from the junction of the pedicles and lamina. We're talking about the pedicles and the lamina. Remember, in between the pedicle and the lamina would be the transverse process. We have 2 superior and 2 inferior articulating processes. What those form, when combined, the inferior with the superior, is a zygopophasal joint. It's also known as the interarticular facet. For short, you may use zygopophasal or ZA. ZA would be an abbreviation for zygopophasal. Lateral picture or semi-oblique picture on this one. We can see the spinous process or just coming around to the lateral side would be the lamina. And then we have this facet or joint coming downward. That'd be the inferior. And one from the vertebrae below would be considered the superior. The joint itself is a zygopophasal joint. Do you note that these are a cervical vertebrae? You can see that the transverse process do angle inferiorly, but you will note that when we look at the thoracic spine, the angle tends to be greater. And then we have our intervertebral foramina on the cervical, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. So, what's your thought? Cervical, thoracic, or lumbar on this lateral? %33% chance here.
Thoracic?
Thoracic, that's what I'm thinking too.
Good. First of all, note that the spinous process is angled downward. It's not rounded. If it was rounded, it would be a lumbar. So now we have to decide, well, it's angled downward. Is it a cervical or thoracic? Well, what gives it away is that these facets are here. This little portion here is where the ribs attach to. So it's a dead giveaway. Plus, there's not an intervertebral foramina coming off of it. So generally, for all vertebrae, we have a body. Posterior to the body would be the pedicle. Posterior to the pedicles would be the transverse processes. Posterior to the transverse would be the laminas. Posterior to the lamina would be the spinous process. Now, in the lateral, we can see the superior articulating facet. And these are facets for the ribs. And that one is too a demifacet, or a half facet. So let's start with a little question here. What is number one? Number one would be between the spine or the spinous process and the transverse. What is this region?
Pedicle?
Lamina.
No. Other one. Yes.
Lamina.
Lamina. Number two. I'm sorry, Andy.
Intervertebral foramina.
No, actually, this would be the vertebral canal. This is where the spinal cord goes down through. Number three, the whole big section.
Body.
Body, correct? What's posterior to the body and anterior to the transverse?
Pedicle?
Section? That would be the pedicle, correct. Number five.
Transverse process.
Transverse. Number six would be if this process was jetting upward. This process jetting upward. Superior articular process. Jetting upward. And number seven is jetting downward or projected downward. So this one, that would be the inferior, correct. Last, number eight, the process at the very back.
Spinous.
You got it. So now, going forward to see the differences between the vertebrae, I've been mentioning about the shape and direction of the spinous process. But now we'll go specifically through the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar here. There are two vertebrae that are very unique in the cervical, and that would be C1 and C2. Do note that C1 is called the atlas, C2 is called the axis. The way that I remember is the Greek mythology Atlas supported the world on his shoulders, correct? The head would be supported by C1. That's how I tend to remember. Also, the other way of remembering axis or the differences between the atlas and axis is that an axis is literally a point that rotates around. The dens process of C2 is the axis point by which the head will rotate. They're very different in look. Be sure to be able to differentiate between the atlas and the axis. Okay, so we have basically the same major components of it. Other than this, the C1 does not have a body on the anterior side. C2 has a body, but it has a protuberance going cephalically or upward called the dens process. The body would be in this region. Posterior to that would be the pedicle. We do have transverse processes, which would be similar to all vertebrae. Posterior to that would be the lamina and then the spinous process. Most cervical vertebrae will have a bifid tip on the spinous process. Bifid meaning two. They project singularly downward or outward, and they bifurcate into two. So do note the difference between C1 and C2, the atlas and axis. Now, when we go through the vertebrae of C3 through 7, they become very familiar or very similar to what we have gone over already. We have a body. We would have the pedicle region, transverse, lamina, spinous. The difference is that we have transverse foraminas coming off of the cervical. This is where nerve bundles traverse down through in the upper region of our body. We do have the superior articular facet, and then we have the inferior, so they lock together. And then we have the intervertebral foraminas also that are a combination of the vertebrae above and the vertebrae below. We're looking at a hole. Here's another hole that nerves come out of. Thoracic. To differentiate a thoracic, note the angle of the spinous process. Here's the cervical, more horizontal. We have more ability to extend our head back than extend our thoracic spine back because of the spinous process. Once again, on the anterior view or superior view of a thoracic vertebrae, we have the body. Posterior to the body would be the pedicle, transverse processes, lamina, spinous process. What makes them different is that we have costal facets that allow for the union or joining of the ribs to the thoracic spine. They also have the superior and where's the inferior? Costal. Well, there's the superior articulating facet. There's the inferior. So they're all similar, but they all have a little something different between the cervical thoracic and then also the lumbar. So here's the lumbar, 5 lumbar vertebrae. We would have the body. This happens to be the disc. Posterior to the body would be the pedicles on either side. Transverse process, lamina, spinous process. When we look at them from a lateral, you can see the difference between all 3 of them. Note how rounded the lumbar spinous process is. Note the angle of the thoracic is really angled inferiorly. Cervical is more horizontal with a slight angulation inferiorly. And here's the last slide. I've said it to all of you guys, I've got your back.